Have you ever wondered why the very first civilization in human history began not with a monument, not with a law, not with a king, but with a streak of light falling across the sky? On a Mesopotamian night, with thin veils of mist curling around the canals like the last breaths rising from the earth, a clay tablet lay waiting in the darkness of a collapsed room. The tilt of a small oil lamp cast trembling bands of light across its surface, revealing wedge-shaped symbols carved sharply and deeply, as if the writer had tried to hold on to something before the memory slipped away. On that tablet there was no prayer to the gods, no record of harvest, no mark of a new dynasty. There was only one line, short, cold, and completely unadorned, a streak of light cutting across the sky and vanishing in the west. To a modern observer, it would be nothing more than a passing phenomenon. But to the Sumerians, people who believed the sky was a mirror reflecting the order of the universe, any disturbance above carried a meaning they did not yet have the language to explain. For them, the sky was never just the sky. It was the place where the first signals of the world appeared before consequences reached the ground. That is why the value of this tablet lies not in the streak itself, but in the choice to record it. A light that existed for only a heartbeat was pressed into clay, an intentional act, as if the writer believed what they had witnessed did not belong only to that night, but to a larger pattern, part of a sequence of things that had happened before and would happen again. The Mesopotamian night remained silent, as if it had never held any sign at all. Yet this small tablet became the beginning of a tradition that would last for thousands of years, a tradition of people who looked to the sky to understand their own fate, who saw every falling light as a question their generation could not yet answer. And from that moment, the moment a streak of light was carved into clay like a piece of memory, the first doorway of the story opened, leading us into the quiet obsession they left behind for all who would come after. When we open the earliest tablets left behind by the Sumerians, the surprising thing is not what they wrote about the world around them, but what they did not write. There are no rice fields, no livestock counts, no lists of offerings. The things we would expect to appear in the very first pages of a civilization, just learning how to organize its life. Instead, the roughest wedge-shaped signs point upward, recording faint changes in the sky, an unusual movement, a strange brightness, a wandering point of light drifting away from its familiar path. It is as if, from the very first moment they learned to shape a thought with carved lines, they used that gift not to manage land, but to hold on to things far too easy to disappear. A streak of light lasts only a heartbeat. A shift in the color of the sky fades within a few breaths. But the feeling those sights stirred in them, that vague alertness that something larger was moving, lingered much longer. Maybe that is why writing was born, as a way to preserve the moments memory could not hold and the fears they had no words yet to express. To the Sumerians, the sky was not empty space. It was a place where invisible collisions between order and chaos left their marks. And because they could not yet understand those marks, they chose the only thing they could do, record them piece by piece until someday a pattern might begin to emerge. Across every tablet, one truth becomes clear. They did not write to explain, they wrote so they would not forget. Each carved symbol carries the seriousness of a civilization that believed the sky never changed without reason, and that if the reason lay beyond their reach, at least they could gather its traces into history. And then, as enough of those traces accumulated, a larger question began to take shape. Not within the text itself, but in the silence between the lines. A question only later generations would be able to see. What did they witness? that made them begin the story of humanity by writing toward the sky. When the Sumerians tried to make sense of the wandering streaks of light they saw in the sky, they had no scientific language to describe velocity, trajectory, or energy. Instead, they reached for the only language powerful enough to hold their astonishment: mythology. And within those stories, we find something strange, as if their sacred world was built from the very moments when the heavens were torn open by fire. Many of their most important gods did not appear in human form, but as phenomena so bright they could split the night. Some descended in a blinding radiance no one dared look at directly. Others arrived with a long blade of light carved across the sky, leaving behind a deep, compressed echo that burst outward like the quickened breath of the earth. Some bore simple but haunting names: the one who comes from the distant sky, the bearer of the shining tail, the one who makes the ground tremble. These images were not baseless inventions. The Sumerians were disciplined observers. They witnessed something too immense to express plainly, and so they borrowed the form of gods, not to exaggerate, but to preserve. Because there are moments when reality is too sharp, too bright, too fast, too terrifying, and only myth can hold it intact across time. If we peel away the sacred language, what remains is familiar to modern eyes: a light falling from space, a long trail of fire, a delayed explosion, a tremor rolling across the ground. Taken together, these fragments resemble an ancient memory, the memory of high-altitude detonations no one of that era could possibly explain. But the true significance is not in how closely these myths match astronomical events. It lies in how the Sumerians transformed the incomprehensible into an orderly system of storytelling, as if each myth were an attempt to keep hold of a moment when the sky changed and no one knew why. And over thousands of years, those very stories opened the way for a shift from myth to record, from the image of a fire-born god to the sober, measured descriptions of real observers. The fire in their myths, then, was not an ending. It was a doorway leading toward the tablets where the Sumerians would begin to record the sky with the precision of witnesses. After generations of retelling the fire in the sky through the language of myth, the Sumerians slowly realized something more important than the light itself. It did not always appear at random. Some streaks flared once and vanished forever, but others returned with a persistence that defied explanation, as if the sky kept its own rhythm, a rhythm only the truly patient could detect. That was when they began doing something entirely different from the generations before them. They counted. In the earliest surviving astronomical tablets, we see etched marks noting nights when there were unusually many lights, seasons when the sky seemed to glow more often than usual, and instances when a long, impossibly long tail of light appeared in the same familiar corner of the heavens. The Sumerians had no word for comet, but they had a simple, chilling name for it: the one who returns. Their persistence in observation allowed them to notice something very few young civilizations could ever perceive. If a bright sign in the sky coincided with a year of poor harvests, or if a glowing tail appeared just before disease spread, then its return could not be dismissed as a matter of chance. In their worldview, the sky moved in patterns, and if it repeated, then there must be a pulse within it that humans needed to read if they hoped to survive. So they began recording not only the shape of the light, but the interval between its reappearances. This marked a turning point in their thinking, a shift from describing isolated events to searching for cycles. They transformed the sky into a kind of calendar, not a calendar for crops, but a calendar of signs that could alter the course of human fate. And among all the rhythms they carefully carved into clay, one cycle stood out like a faint disturbance beneath the flow of data. not because it was rare, but because every time it appeared, the earth itself seemed to change in ways that were hard to ignore. The observers, long accustomed to the steady order of the heavens, began to feel a quiet but unshakable unease, the sense that they were tracing the remnants of something that had happened far in the past. A cycle, calm as a breath, yet surrounded by the intuition that something was not right. And in time, that very cycle became their most enduring fear. As Sumerian sky-watching slowly grew beyond scattered observations, everything they saw, the lights, the shifting colors of the sky, the strange changes in wind and rain, began to merge into something far larger than the purpose they started with. And through generations of copying, sorting, and comparing, a massive body of text took shape, Enuma Anu Enlil, a library of signs as if they were distilling every heartbeat of the sky into clay. What makes this collection extraordinary is not its sheer size, but the way it reveals the mind of a civilization stepping out of myth and into the early stages of modeling the world. Across hundreds of tablets, light was no longer described as a moment of wonder. It was recorded with deliberate specificity, shifting shades of red, differing angles of descent, the length of a glowing tail, and even faint tremors that seemed to ripple through the ground. Seen through modern eyes, many of these descriptions match what we now associate with objects entering Earth's atmosphere. But the Sumerians were not using them to tell a sacred story. They observed, compared, and then did something only a civilization capable of systematic thinking would dare attempt. They linked the sky to the earth through a chain of correlations. If a particular red glow had once appeared before a drought, they paid attention to that same red glow the next time it appeared. If an unusually long tail of light coincided with a failed harvest, it was placed into the category of signs that demanded caution. Each tablet was like a link in a long chain, a way for them to search for the hidden rhythm beneath what looked like randomness. And within the layering of these notes, something strange began to emerge. Certain descriptions were copied far more often than others, as if the Sumerians were trying to make sure later generations understood that not all lights in the sky were the same. Some lines carried a tone far more urgent than the rest. Short, sharp, like a message from someone who had witnessed something that exceeded ordinary experience. When these warnings are placed side by side, they carry the weight of something outside the familiar cycles of nature, not floods, not droughts, not shifting seasons. They carry the sense of a threat, not born of the earth at all, something they could describe only by recording its consequences. And at the boundary between caution and helplessness, another strange tablet begins to appear in the record, a tablet whose structure suggests that the Sumerians had moved beyond observation. They may have begun trying to understand why those signs repeated. A tablet like a key, one that opens into the next layer of the mystery. Among the countless tablets scattered across Mesopotamia, there is a small piece of clay from Telbrak that once made researchers pause for far longer than they expected. Not because its carvings were beautiful or rare, but because its layout looked nothing like any record the Sumerians typically left behind. It does not carry the tone of a prayer, nor the structure of an inventory. Instead, it looks like a sketch, but not a sketch of a person or an object. It is a sketch of motion across the sky. A long incision cuts diagonally across the tablet, slanting toward the southwest. Beside it are clusters of symbols placed in careful positions, as if the writer was trying to record not just what the light looked like, but how it moved. For a civilization with only the naked eye and inherited memory, paying attention to the angle of descent was a leap forward, a shift from observing to analyzing. They were not simply watching that streak of light, they were trying to read its motion. But the strangest part lies at the bottom of the tablet. The same set of symbols appears twice in two different places, as if the writer was marking two separate moments of the same phenomenon. That tiny detail has led many scholars to believe this is not a record of a single night. It feels as though someone realized that this light had followed this same path before, and might follow it again. If this interpretation is correct, Tel Brak may be one of the earliest places where humans attempted to draw the trajectory of a celestial object, not to worship it, but to understand it, not to build myth, but to identify a cycle. From that perspective, the tablet is no longer describing a bright streak, it is describing an orbit, a quiet hint that the Sumerians had begun to see the sky as something governed by rules, not randomness. Even the small symbols indicating how the light faded carry the imprint of that mindset, not the emotions of a witness, but the deliberate effort to preserve a detail they believed might matter when compared with future observations, as though they were arranging pieces of a puzzle whose final image they themselves could not yet see. And it is precisely this repetition, the steady lines, the duplicated markings, that makes the tablet far more important than its size suggests. It is not merely the memory of an unusual night. It is evidence that the Sumerians were beginning to grasp something transformative. The sky was not only to be looked at, it could be read. And once they began reading it like a text, the idea of prediction quietly took root. When tablets from many centuries are placed side by side, another layer of pattern begins to emerge, subtler than the diagonal lines marking trajectories, yet consistent enough to make modern readers pause. The Sumerians were not only recording the motion of light, they were recording shifts in the air, in the color of the sky, in the stillness of the night, as if they believed the heavens sent signs not only through streaks of fire, but through its very breath. In many tablets, the sky is described as darker than usual, or as having a hue no sunset could produce. At times, there is mention of a faint dust so light it could not be heard when it fell, but strong enough to blur the moon as though covered by a thin veil. With modern knowledge, these descriptions point toward atmospheric disturbances, the sort that might accompany large events far beyond human sight. There are also nights marked by sudden flashes. Not thunder, not flame, but a thin, cold light severed from any sound, as if created so high above that its echo never reached the ground. The Sumerians could not explain it, but they recognized it as different, and so they carved it into clay as yet another parameter of the sky. At times, a tablet mentions the smell of heated stone, or winds carrying a metallic taste, small details that show the writer was trying to preserve not only what they saw, but what their bodies sensed. It seems they believed any change, no matter how delicate, might be a clue to something greater moving toward them. What stands out most is not the phenomena themselves, but the tone of the recorders. There is no exaggeration, no plea to the gods. The descriptions read more like a laboratory than a temple, crisp, sparse, decisive, as if the writer were observing not the sky, but a recurring experiment. And then, amid these steady notes, one kind of detail troubled them more than any strange color or unexpected flash, a sign appearing at the wrong time. What should have arrived early in the season appeared late. What normally appeared near the end showed up too soon. In a civilization that believed deeply in the rhythm of the heavens, such a shift was the greatest warning of all. For when a light changes color or flickers unexpectedly, they could still view it as part of nature's familiar behavior. But when its timing shifted, they understood that something far beyond their knowledge was touching the order that kept the world steady. And it was this break in rhythm, more than any brilliant spectacle, that made the Sumerians truly uneasy. If the people outside the cities recorded the sky with the anxious instinct of those who lived close to nature, Then inside the palaces, that same act of watching transformed into a different kind of knowledge. Cautious, structured, and intensely analytical. The individuals we now call astrologers were not vague prophets. They were men standing at the boundary between early science and political responsibility, men who climbed the tops of ziggurats night after night to measure the smallest shifts of light across what seemed like an unmoving axis. For them, the sky was not simply a realm of signs, it was a floating spreadsheet. Every point of light, every subtle fade, every appearance out of rhythm was recorded like a number in a model they had been quietly building across generations. Their task was not to announce the future on a whim, but to compare, to match each celestial event with the earthly consequences that had once followed it, and to extract patterns that only long stretches of time could reveal. In the tablets sent into the palace archives, we see echoes of the Telbrac descriptions, diagonal lines, falling angles, deviations in brightness, but arranged with far tighter logic. Some tablets track shifts in the sky's color, others simply mark nights that were not normal. And then there are the tablets carved in a deliberately clipped hand, as if the writer wanted to speak something aloud, yet feared the meaning of their own words. These were the tablets sealed and set aside for the king and a few trusted advisers. They did not tell stories, they issued warnings. The returning one changes direction. The light falls outside its season, a sign of instability before the waters. The lines are written with a restrained tone, as if the writer were trying to stay calm in the face of a rule they once believed unbreakable, beginning to shift. And then, among these warnings, there is one short sentence that makes modern scholars shiver. The visitor returns early. In a civilization built on cycles, early was a word of chaos. If a light that had held a steady rhythm across generations suddenly appeared at the wrong time, the problem was not with the light. It was with the entire framework they used to understand the world. The court astrologers understood this. They knew that if the orbit had changed, they were no longer witnessing a mere astronomical event, but a disturbance that could threaten the stability of their land. And so one particular tablet, carved from the finest clay, its strokes sharp as a drawn wire, was copied and placed directly into the palace's secret archive. It was not long, not decorated, just a handful of lines condensed to the point where emotion had no room to escape. A few thin strokes, like a breath being held. And from the moment it was set into the darkness of the royal vault, the prediction no longer belonged to the scribe. It belonged to history, and to anyone patient enough to read the sky the way the Sumerians once did. Among the countless signs the Sumerians tracked across many centuries, one object drew their caution more than all the rest, a moving point of light that behaved unlike any star they had ever known. It did not stay fixed. It did not follow the paths of the constellations. Yet every time it appeared, it carried the same unsettling impression. Something strange was returning from the deep reaches of the sky. On the tablets, they did not give it a god's name, nor tie it to a ritual. They used only a simple, chilling phrase, the strange star, an object they could not yet name, but one important enough to carve into clay. What caught their attention was not just its brightness, though on some nights it glowed so fiercely it remained visible even during twilight, but the consistency of its path. Whether bright or dim, whether its tail long or short, it always rose from the same familiar direction and vanished at almost the same point along the horizon. Its rhythm was too long for any single lifetime to recognize, but the palace astrologers and inheritors of a task passed down through generations had the patience to connect those cycles into a single line stretching across time. To modern eyes, these descriptions point towards something recognizable, a long-period comet, a traveler so distant that humanity has time to forget it entirely before it circles back. But for the Sumerians, that familiarity offered no comfort. Instead, it carried the weight of something encoded into the order of the heavens, an object that returned regularly enough to be a cycle, yet remained strange enough to inspire fear. Then in later tablets, a small but unsettling change appeared, symbols marking variations in its path, not dramatic ones, just a slight shift in its angle of descent, a difference too subtle for long description, but significant enough for the scribe to mark it with a special sign. For an object moving at unimaginable speed, such a shift was anything but small. They understood well, a change of only a few degrees meant its entire course would no longer resemble what it once had been. And it was in that moment, when the familiar rhythm broke, that the strange star transformed from an object of observation into an object of fear. This deviation was not something they had expected, nor something they were willing to ignore. If a once safe cycle began to drift, then its return was no longer merely an astronomical event. It became the sign of a danger, a potential collision that the Sumerians, without modern science, were nonetheless sharp enough to sense through the sky's slight but ominous shift. And from this point on, that cycle led them toward a single, growing question. What happens if the next return is not like the ones before? When the strange star had returned often enough to form a recognizable sequence, the Sumerians no longer stopped at simply recording it. They began doing something only truly persistent civilizations could imagine. They turned the sky into a problem to be solved. Every night, those standing atop the ziggurat wrote down its brightness, its relative speed, the length of its glowing tail, and the point where it touched the horizon. These markings, though carved in ancient symbols, carried the character of a measurement system rather than a storyteller's description. Over generations, they connected into a rough model of motion to show that the object did not simply repeat its path. It was shifting little by little, like a traveler, choosing a slightly different route each time it returned. From a modern perspective, we know that even a slight change in a comet's orbit can bring it closer to Earth's path with every cycle. But what is astonishing is that the Sumerians, without telescopes or formal mathematics, were still able to detect that trend with nothing more than their eyes and an unbroken tradition of record-keeping. It shows us they were not just watchers of the sky. They were some of humanity's earliest analysts laying the first stones of astronomical prediction. One tablet in particular describes a path that moves closer to the course of the sun, a phrase that fascinates researchers today. They had no concept of Earth orbiting the sun, yet the wording reveals they noticed a strange convergence between the object's route and the region of the heavens where Earth appeared during certain times of the year. In their worldview, this was the meeting point between two forces, a movement from above and a movement belonging to their own world. And if those two lines were drawing nearer, the Sumerians understood that it was not a coincidence, it was a trend not born of rumor or ritual, but of the sky's own pattern, something they had studied across generations until they recognized that the strange star's path was drifting toward danger. From that moment on, their fear was no longer vague, no longer symbolic, the way it had been at the beginning of this story. It had edges now, shape, reason, structure. This was no longer the fear of people startled by unusual lights. It was the fear of people who understood orbits. And when the model they had pieced together revealed that the star's path was tilting toward the region of the heavens Earth would pass through, they knew the past was not something that stayed behind them. It was moving closer. and this time perhaps on a completely new trajectory. The story begins to tighten now, like a curve accelerating toward a point of collision. When the court astrologers realized the strange star's orbit was drifting in a dangerous direction, they stopped looking only at the sky. They began watching what happened beneath their own feet. The small but steady disturbances that felt like echoes traveling down from somewhere far beyond. Across many tablets we find lines describing tremors so slight they were almost indistinguishable, a jar of water rippling, a pinch of dust falling from a ceiling beam, or a thin wave spreading across a still pond in the middle of the night. To modern eyes, these might be natural microquakes, or the distant compression waves of an atmospheric explosion. But to the Sumerians, who believed the earth always answered the sky, these tremors were anything but meaningless. Some tablets speak of a fine layer of dust settling on everything during days with no wind. Dust so light it could sit on the surface of water without sinking, unlike ash from a kiln or embers from ritual fires. The scribes did not know where it came from, but they were careful enough to record every occurrence, as though their instincts told them it was part of a larger pattern. Then came the strange seasons, changes not driven by drought or flood, but by what they called a weakened sun, mist that would not lift, a coldness hidden in the wind. These descriptions, once again, align perfectly with the atmospheric disturbances modern science associates with high-altitude explosions. But the Sumerians had no tools to explain them. They had only memories of harvests that behaved differently in the same years the strange star returned. What stands out most is how they placed these phenomena side by side. There was no exaggeration, no religious flourish, only repetition. When the sky showed a certain sign, the earth shifted in quiet, precise ways. And over generations of record-keeping, such coincidences stopped looking accidental. A silent fear began to take shape, not fear of the brilliant lights above, but of a cycle, a cold rhythm linking heaven and earth through changes so subtle that only the most patient observers could detect them. They began to understand that what they were tracking was not a single event, but a larger rotation, a deeper pattern that might have left marks in the distant past. And just as they were trying to piece those fragments together, one night arrived, a night when the sky seemed to bring every earlier record back to life in their minds. A night when the light did not simply appear but seemed intent on reminding them of exactly what they had feared all along. That night, the sky over Mesopotamia burst into brilliance, as if an invisible hand had sliced a streak of fire across the dark fabric of the world. What astonishes scholars today is not merely the light itself, but the fact that city-states, separated by hundreds of kilometers, Nippur, Kish, Lagash, all carved the same moment, the same direction of light, the same flash and sudden extinguishing, a rare, unified chorus in the historical record. In the surviving tablets, the streak is described as a massive blade, sharp enough that even the ground cast shadows. The first flare burned white like heated metal, then shifted slowly to red and finally dissolved into darkness, as though pulled into an invisible tear in the sky. Many records mention a strange silence. The explosion arrived too late, or the sound was held back in the air, as if the atmosphere itself had been gripped by something that squeezed it into stillness. Today we call this a bolide, the atmospheric explosion of a large meteor. But for the Sumerians, that night was a confirmation. Everything they had recorded across scattered generations, the shifting sky colors, the fine dust falling from nowhere, the chill that seeped into the growing season, all snapped into place within a single moment. It was no longer the story of priests, no longer a model scratched into clay. It was real light erupting above them, cleaving the night in two. Perhaps that is why, after the blaze faded, silence appears in the tablets more often than any ritual. On the tops of ziggurats, the watchers who once counted stars with steady patience now stood motionless for hours, not because they were stunned, but because they understood that what they had tracked for so long had stepped out of speculation. It had size, speed, a tail of fire, and the force of something capable of altering the fate of the earth itself. That night did not only illuminate the sky, it illuminated the quiet fear they had carried within them. And from that night onward, they began doing something that had previously lived only as a shadow of dread. They calculated the cycle of its return, not to admire the beauty of the universe, but to determine the most dangerous moment, the point at which the object's path might sweep across the root of the earth. From that night, they understood that what they had been watching could come back. After the night when the sky split open like a blade drawn across the universe, the Sumerian observers no longer looked upward with the awe of startled witnesses. They entered an entirely new phase, decoding. In the surviving tablets we can clearly see the shift in tone. The emotional strokes disappear, replaced by repeated measuring symbols, carved with the patience of people who understood that even the smallest error could throw an entire prediction off course. Slanted lines were carved in parallel, each one representing the angle of descent of the light during a particular appearance. Placed together, they form what we now recognize as a primitive orbital diagram, a sequence that allowed them to see something the naked eye alone could not, the gradual drift in the object's path. For them, the sky was no longer a place where gods descended, but a vast spreadsheet where each angled line was a data point. Some lines were carved longer or deeper, likely to record apparent speed. The faster the light tore across the night, the longer the stroke. Additional symbols, the fading of the tail, shifts in color, the steepness of its angle against the horizon, show that the Sumerians were not documenting a single event, but the differences between each return. This was the first breath of orbital thinking. Most important were the notes on timing. One tablet might read, "Year X of King Y, the fire returns," and several generations later, "Year Z, the fire tilts further." Their repetition tells us they had recognized the object's cycle, and even more remarkably, they knew it was changing. For a civilization with no concept of a solar system, linking appearances separated by entire lifetimes was a monumental leap in thought. All of it pointed toward a bold possibility they seemed to grasp. If an orbit can shift, it can also cut across Earth's path. And if that happened during a cycle when the returning light was stronger than before, the consequences would move far beyond mild tremors or a sky-changing color. When they gathered all the recorded dates, laid them along an imagined line of time, a number emerged, not a prophecy, not a symbol, but the result of a calculation. The interval between returns was shrinking, and the orbit was angling ever closer to the region of the sky Earth would later pass through. That was the moment they understood the sky's equation was no longer the knowledge. It was a warning. And based on every fragment of data collected over many generations, they identified a specific year. A moment when the object, if it continued along its drifting path, would pass nearer to Earth than in any previous cycle. A day when all their fears converged into a single point. A day they believed carried the highest risk of catastrophe. From the earliest days, the Sumerians told stories about the day the sky opened, fire falling from the heavens, and the earth trembling as if breathing. For generations, these phrases were dismissed as metaphor, the imaginative language of a people who lacked the tools of science. Yet thousands of years later, when researchers drilled deep into the ancient soils of the Near East, something remarkable happened. The Earth began telling a story almost identical to the one whispered in old temple walls. In the sediment layers, geologists found a thin sheet of fine dust, so delicate it dispersed like smoke with a single touch. But its composition, silica, metal oxides, particles melted and cooled in an instant, bore the unmistakable signature of a massive atmospheric explosion. Mixed within that layer were tiny glassy spherules, perfectly round grains no larger than sand, the kind that form only when stone and soil are flash-heated beyond anything nature usually allows. Further analysis of soil cores revealed another anomaly. Paleobotanists found a sudden disruption in plant history. Warm season pollen vanished for several years, replaced by species adapted to colder conditions. This abrupt shift was brief, but sharp enough to carve a fracture into the climate record. A pattern perfectly consistent with a large dust cloud entering the atmosphere and dimming sunlight. And strangely, all of this aligns with the exact period when Sumerian writing about the sky changed tone, from calm observation to tense warnings. It was as if they had not only witnessed the fiery streak that tore across their night sky, but had lived inside its aftermath, the earth turning color, the air taking on a different feel, the rhythm of seasons faltering. If mythology speaks of a long night without the moon, geology speaks of a dust veil thick enough to blur the horizon. If myth says the gods were hidden, science shows us an atmosphere once wrapped in a thin, cold, opaque haze. Two storytellers, one human, one planetary, separated by millennia, suddenly fitting together like two lost fragments of the same map. And at the center of that convergence rises a single ancient tablet, one far more important than most. Not because it speaks of angry gods or omens of fire, but because it does something mythology almost never attempts. It tries to reconstruct the logic of return, a kind of cycle the scribes seemed to believe had happened before, and could happen again. From here onward, the mystery of the Sumerians is no longer found in the stories they told, but in the model they left behind. A model that leads directly to the next enigmatic tablet. Among the hundreds of tablets that speak of signs in the sky, there is one small tablet copied in the finest clay, carved with strokes so steady it feels as though the scribe understood that even a single misplaced line could distort the meaning. It is not long, not ornate, yet it holds 6 signs the Sumerian astrologers treated as a complete sequence, a miniature script leading toward the day the sky falls. Each sign is carved with an unusual decisiveness, as if there was no room for metaphor or mistake. A red glow spreads across the sky. The Sumerians wrote only, "The sky is red like coal." Today we know that color comes from ionized dust when a large meteoroid tears through the atmosphere, but for them it was the opening line of a catastrophe, a trembling without a sound. They described it as a noise with no voice, a perfect paradox for the shockwave that arrives before the boom in high-altitude airbursts. A long tail of fire, a blazing streak slicing across the heavens, classic bow-line behavior, carved as a single, sharp line, straight and bright like the blade of an unnamed god, black dust falling. For them, it was ash, not born of fire. For modern science, it is ultrafine debris formed when a meteoroid vaporizes into stone and metal vapor. The air changes, just one line, the breath of the earth grows cold. Now we know atmospheric dust can lower temperatures for several seasons, but the Sumerians simply said the land had changed its breath. Water rises. Not a world-ending flood, but sudden swelling of rivers after strange rainfall patterns triggered by atmospheric disruption. They wrote plainly, the water passes its limit. Taken separately, the 6 signs could be 6 unrelated events, but placed in sequence, when copied for generations, they formed a chilling logic. And astonishingly, that sequence aligns almost perfectly with what modern science identifies as the cascading effects of a large atmospheric impact: sky glow, shockwave, bolide fire trail, particulate fallout, cooling, hydrological disturbance. What unsettles scholars today is not the signs themselves, but the single line written beneath them, a line that does not tell a story, does not invoke a god, but gives an order. When they come together, the scribe must count again the years of the fire. This is no longer a description of the past. It is an instruction for the future, a command to ensure that anyone living after the author would understand these 6 signs do not belong to a one-time disaster. They belong to a cycle that could return. And if it ever returned, the consequence would be more than a warning. And when we look at the tablets produced after this period, one fact becomes unmistakable. The Sumerians truly began counting. They logged every return of the strange star, tracked each slight shift in its fiery path, marked every interval on a long chain of years, as if facing a calculation they could not afford to misread. From scattered signs they moved toward a model. From the model they moved toward a cycle. And from that cycle they reached the most terrifying conclusion an ancient civilization could form: a specific day. A day when all 6 signs could align again. A day they believed might be the end of everything. When the 6 signs were finally gathered into a complete sequence, the Sumerians stepped out of the haze of myth and into the threshold of mathematics. They began doing something that should have been impossible for a civilization 4,000 years old, constructing a cycle, not a cycle of seasons nor a ritual calendar, but a cycle for the very fire that had swept across their sky again and again. In the surviving tablets we find numbers repeating, not in the rhythm of offerings or temple rites, but in the rhythm of a formula slowly coming into focus. They recorded the year the fire returned, then compared it to the one before. How many years had passed, whether the brightness rose or dimmed, whether the tail stretched longer or shorter, how much the descent angle shifted. Each mark is like a tiny notch on a timeline they were trying to straighten with nothing but bare hands and ancient intuition. And then, between those scattered years, a pattern began to show itself. Not perfect, but steady enough to signal something more. A cycle. A slow breath of a celestial traveler, they believed, had crossed their sky long before the first city was ever built. Some modern scholars argue that the Sumerians brushed against the concept of a long-period orbit without knowing they had done so. But the Sumerians never used such words. They spoke only of the time before and the time yet to come, of the changing light, of the falling path, tilting. And they noticed something any civilization that watches long enough would also see. Every time the fire came back, the world beneath their feet shifted. Harvests grew more erratic, the air cooled faster, the ground trembled more softly. When the coincidences became too many, they understood they were no longer witnessing a beautiful sky event, but a rule, one that could slip easily into disaster. And so they began calculating the next return. In one tablet, considered the most meticulous in the entire archive, its carvings crisp, its clay refined, its symbols spaced evenly as though the scribe feared a single slip would break the logic, they etched a single number. Not a festival year, not a royal reign, not an eclipse. A year they believed the celestial fire would return closest. A year when its cycle and Earth's path might cross at the most dangerous point. No one knows whether their calculation was right or wrong, but the tablet that follows contains a line far more unsettling than the number itself. The scribe must warn the king in the year before the return. No ceremony, no metaphor, a direct alarm. And once a number becomes a warning, it can no longer sleep in an archive. It escapes through the whispers of temple priests, through the silences in royal councils, through the worried eyes of the watchers standing atop the ziggurats. No one knows how many truly understood the meaning of that number. But the fear was universal. The danger now had a name. And within a few years that fear spread across Mesopotamia like a shadow no one could see, yet everyone could feel. When the fated number no longer slept in the shadows of the royal archive but began slipping outward through the whispers of priests and palace advisors, something shifted across the Sumerian cities. No proclamation was issued, no decree was carved into stone. Yet the city-states changed in ways that only happen when people believe that something unseen is drawing near. Walls once meant to hold back floods or fend off tribal skirmishes were rebuilt with deeper foundations, thicker stone, and gates reinforced with hard timber and hammered bronze. The style of construction no longer resembled preparation for an enemy approaching from afar. It looked like they were bracing for a shockwave that might rise from the ground itself, a fear born in the sky but destined to strike the earth. On the summits of the ziggurats, architects were ordered to replace wooden roof beams with heavy stone slabs, as if the highest points of the city needed to endure whatever fire might fall from above. No record explains why, but the priorities alone reveal the truth. They were preparing for what descended from the heavens, not what marched across the horizon. In their rituals, the transformation was even clearer. Prayers to the sky gods multiplied, but their wording no longer resembled the requests of peaceful years. The Sumerians did not ask for gentle rains or victory over rivals. They prayed to avoid the fire shaped like a sign. Those words were not symbolic. They carried the tone of people who had seen something, decoded it, and feared they had understood correctly. Inside the palace, prophecy tablets and celestial forecasts were copied more often than in any other period. Symbols once written only for expert astrologers were carved with sharper precision, the spacing between strokes more deliberate, as if they wanted to ensure that anyone reading them in the future could not possibly misinterpret the message. In Sumer, copying was never casual. Copying was storing knowledge for a moment of crisis. Even daily life shifted in silence. Granaries grew heavier with grain. Non-essential public works were halted. Resources were redirected to fortifying foundations, walls, and flood canals. A society that once expanded proudly along its rivers now slowly folded inward, as if trying to shrink the surface exposed to a coming danger. And though all of this seemed like a reasonable response to signs from the sky, the Sumerians understood one truth that no stone wall could hide, no building could withstand fire from the heavens, and no ritual could alter the path of an object hurtling toward them with a speed that belonged to another world. What they were doing was not to stop what might be coming. It was simply to avoid feeling completely powerless before it, because they knew every preparation was only a temporary shield against a fear no human hand could hold back. For centuries, the Sumerian accounts of fire ripping across the sky, of black dust falling, of the air itself turning strange, were dismissed as exaggerations from a civilization that mythologized whatever it could not explain. But then geological science began peeling back the layers of earth around the Euphrates and the Tigris, and the ground, silent for 4,000 years, began speaking in its own language. Across several points along the river basin, geologists found a thin sediment layer filled with microtectites, Tiny spheres no larger than fine sand, clear like frozen droplets, formed only when matter is heated until it melts and then cools in a fraction of a second. These were not the marks of volcanoes. They were not remnants of kilns. They were the fingerprints of heat that came from the sky, the atmospheric explosion of a large meteor. What startled researchers was the distribution. The microtectites were not clustered around a typical impact point. They were spread out in a long, wide band, as if a cloud of molten glass had been blown sideways by wind after an explosion high above. And that pattern matched the Sumerian descriptions perfectly. Ash not from fire, sky dust carried by wind, light dimmed for many days. When cores were drilled even deeper, they revealed abrupt chemical shifts in the atmosphere, a sudden spike in sulfate, followed by a rapid decline, with the telltale signature of a meteor airburst that briefly altered how sunlight reflected off the Earth. The temperature curve inside the soil layers showed a short, sharp cooling phase lasting only a few seasons, exactly like the Sumerians' phrase, "the breath of the earth turned cold." Placed side by side, the data and the ancient text formed an alignment almost impossible to dismiss. The Sumerians describe what they saw, the earth recorded what it endured, and the two stories, separated by 4 millennia, matched so closely they mirrored each other. Even more striking, the time stamp of the meteor glass layer overlaps precisely with the period when Sumerian tablets shift in tone, from calm observation to warning. That means the change was not born from religion, but from memory, from an event their ancestors had lived through, or survived only by witnessing its aftermath. At this point, the question is no longer, did a great fire once fall over Mesopotamia? The ground has already answered, yes, it did. The real question is far more unsettling. What made the Sumerians believe that the fire would return? And those silent layers of earth, echoing the warnings carved by ancient hands, lead us toward an even deeper question, one about memory, cycles, and the fear of a civilization standing between the sky above and the ground beneath. Long before the Sumerians pressed their first wedge-shaped marks into wet clay, there stretched a vast wordless era, millennia in which the earth endured upheavals so great that no early culture could truly forget them, even without written language. One of those upheavals was the Younger Dryas event, a time when mounting evidence suggests a cluster of meteor explosions tore across the sky of the northern hemisphere, igniting streaks of fire bright enough to stain the heavens and shift the planet's climate in just a matter of days. The Sumerians were born long after that catastrophe. But its memory, the memory of sky fire, black dust, long cold nights and waters rising where they shouldn't, may not have died with the communities that first witnessed it. It may have survived through hundreds of generations in the form of fireside stories, obscure rituals and taboos whose original meanings had faded away. Without writing, such memory could still travel, drifting south into Mesopotamia, carrying fragments of imagery, a sky red like burning coal, the earth breathing hard, water crossing its bounds, light falling from where no hand could reach. Over time, these primal stories blended into local mythologies. What had once been the memories of survivors became the memories of gods. What had once been real scenes of terror turned into motifs, then symbols. And finally, when the Sumerians began forming their own systems of prophecy and sky-watching, those ancient motifs reappeared as omens, as though the entire prehistoric world had been compressed into a few sharp lines etched onto clay. The frightening part is this: when the streak of fire returned in their lifetime, all those stories that once seemed like echoes from another age suddenly aligned with reality. Black dust began to fall, the sky dimmed into a deep red, the air grew cold, and in that moment inherited memory turned into a living warning. The Sumerians feared not only what their eyes saw, they feared what they understood, that their ancestors may have faced the same thing, and that such an event was no random accident. It might be a cycle, one they had just stepped into at the moment of its return. Their fear then was not a fear born in a single generation. It was a fear carried forward from prehistory, from a time before humans could write, but long after they had learned to fear a sky on fire, a memory so deep that no one could recall who told it first, a memory so old it became part of what it meant to be human. And when memory becomes nature, it becomes warning. A warning, the Sumerians believed, did not speak only of a past long gone, but of a future already moving toward them from the sky. At a glance, those ancient tablets look like nothing more than scattered scratches, faint impressions left by a people still learning to understand their world. But when modern scholars place them in chronological order, trace every repeated symbol, and compare them with what we now know about the sky, a staggering picture emerges. The Sumerians did not simply watch the heavens, they decoded them. They achieved something no other civilization of their age even approached. They turned the sky into a problem to be solved. Using a base 60 counting system, a strange invention, yet nearly perfect for dividing angles, time, and cycles, they measured celestial motion with a precision that many cultures thousands of years later still failed to match. They divided the sky into fixed sectors, recorded the exact moment stars rose and set, and built star calendars accurate enough to guide seasons, floods, and the entire rhythm of society. But the tablets that truly leave modern researchers in awe are not the ones about fixed stars. They are the ones about the strange star and the object the Sumerians followed across generations. On several extraordinary tablets, symbols are arranged in angled rows, rising and falling like a pre-scientific graph. These lines were not emotional sketches. Each slant marked the angle of descent for one cycle. Each subsidiary mark recorded a tiny deviation they had noticed over years of watching. The Sumerians were not simply describing a phenomenon, they were laying separate cycles side by side to see whether its path was changing. In some sequences, scholars even recognize the faint outline of rudimentary interpolation, an attempt to predict the object's future position based on its past appearances. In other words, they were brushing against the foundation of orbital calculation, without any concept of a solar system. The margin of error in their data is so small it is hard to believe they gathered it with the naked eye. But the Sumerians possessed something few civilizations ever master: the patience of a people who measured the sky not in years, but in generations. They did not chart the heavens within one lifetime. They charted them across the lifetime of a city, a dynasty, a nation. And when all their numbers are placed beside the modern hypothesis of a long-period comet, the pieces fall into place with eerie precision. They tracked brightness to estimate size. They tracked direction to infer trajectory. They tracked intervals to detect the cycle. They tracked climate changes to register the consequences. Nothing about this was superstition. Nothing was embellishment. It was early empirical science, built from intuition and relentless persistence. And when those primitive numbers began to mirror changes on the ground, fine dust, sudden cold, strange seasons, the Sumerians realized they were no longer observing a beautiful light in the sky. They were listening to a signal, a warning from the universe, close enough for them to notice, but far beyond their power to alter. These numbers, once assembled, open a deeper layer of the mystery, one so compelling that even modern science cannot look away. When the first wedge-shaped tablets were translated into modern languages, most scholars dismissed them as religious texts. vague prophecies, ritual descriptions, poetic metaphors rather than knowledge. But decades later, when astronomers began running computer simulations of long-period comet orbits, something unexpected happened. The simulated trajectories quietly crossed the sky at the exact moments the Sumerians described their strange star. The coincidence wasn't small, it wasn't scattered, it was sharp. Sharp enough to make researchers stop and wonder, could people living 4,000 years ago have been watching the same object modern science is only now recreating on a screen? Some models show that long-period comets, those that take centuries or even millennia to complete a single orbit, passed through the region of space near Mesopotamia precisely during the era when Sumerian tablets shifted in tone from calm observation to urgent warning. Those close approaches would have been enough to trigger large atmospheric explosions, leaving traces in sediment that modern geology continues to uncover today. What makes the connection even more unsettling is the behavior predicted by these simulations. Increasing brightness with each return, shifting tails, a gradual drift in its path, and the possibility, with only a few degrees of gravitational nudging, of intersecting Earth's orbit. All of it matches the descriptions of the Sumerian strange star. Modern science also shows that even tiny gravitational disturbances from giant planets or collisions with cosmic debris can nudge a comet's orbit over time. Those changes don't require telescopes to perceive. All they require is a civilization patient enough, disciplined enough, and confident enough to believe the sky does not move at random. And suddenly the Sumerian texts take on a completely different color. Those angled lines, those repeating symbol pairs, those primitive calculations. They are no longer sacred ritual. They are data collected by an ancient civilization across many generations. Some scholars, after comparing all these threads, have begun asking a bold question. Were the Sumerians the first civilization to recognize that falling stars were not divine messages, but a real threat to life on Earth? And if so, were their tablets not merely records, but warnings for anyone far in the future who might be patient enough to read them? But once we reach that point, another question, larger, darker, closer to humanity's oldest fear, opens immediately. If the Sumerians observed, calculated, and warned, what did they see that convinced them the next return might be the last? That question leads directly into the next part, where their fear no longer belongs to the sky alone, but to the way history repeats itself. When we read the Sumerian tablets that speak of the day the fire returns, a quiet question rises, like the shadow of the very streak they feared. If they calculated so carefully, if they observed across so many generations, why does the catastrophe they feared seem never to have happened? It is here that the story splits into two possibilities, two lines of reasoning that neither science nor history has been able to stitch back together into one final answer. The first possibility, they were wrong. Not because they lacked intelligence, but because they lacked time. A handful of human lifetimes is far too small compared to the rhythm of a long-period comet, which may take thousands of years to complete a single orbit. One slight gravitational nudge from a distant planet, one invisible collision with cosmic debris, and the trajectory they believed they were measuring could shift. In this view, the Sumerians did identify a real danger, but misjudged the moment it would intersect Earth's path. Not wrong in essence, only in timing. And a tiny error, stretched across generations, could easily produce a prediction that humanity would never live long enough to see fulfilled. The second possibility, they were right. The next return simply hasn't happened yet. Some modern simulations reveal objects whose orbits are so long that entire civilizations could rise and fall without ever witnessing a second appearance. A comet could vanish from human memory for millennia. only to come back long after its watchers have turned to dust. If the Sumerian strange star belonged to that category, its absence from our sky is not proof that it never existed. It may only be proof that humanity has not lived long enough, has not filled enough pages of history to witness the larger cycle they tried to record in their brief span of time. In this scenario, their prophecy becomes a quiet, cold reminder. Some dangers do not belong to our era, but they still belong to the planet we live on. And between these two possibilities, human error on one side, the long silence of the universe on the other, no one can say which is truer. The Sumerians did not know. We, 4,000 years later, are not much more certain than they were. And it is this uncertainty that opens the deepest pause in the story, a silence suspended between what might have happened and what might still be on its way. A silence that carries us into the final layer of meaning, where the signs in the sky become reminders of humanity's own fragility. When we look back at everything the Sumerians left behind, the fire that tore across the sky, the black dust that settled over their fields, the numbers they carved to hold the pulse of an invisible cycle, we begin to understand that perhaps they were not trying to warn us about a single meteor. What they tried to say may have been wider, deeper, and closer to the core of human existence itself. Perhaps they were telling us that the great upheavals of Earth are never truly random, that natural disasters, climate shifts, and shocks from the cosmos move on rhythms far longer than a human lifetime, rhythms that only a civilization willing to listen across generations could ever begin to sense. For the Sumerians, the sky was not simply the dwelling place of gods, it was a mirror of fate. And perhaps what they meant to leave behind was not a prophecy of the end, but a simple, unsettling truth. Every civilization is temporary in the face of the forces that shape the universe. Modern researchers reading these tablets through the lens of science also see a different layer, a reminder the Sumerians may have understood long before us. Disasters are not surprises, only humans are too short-lived to recognize their rhythm. Floods, droughts, earthquakes, comets, all of them are parts of a symphony far longer than anything we can imagine. And in that perspective, the warnings carved into the sky become a kind of philosophy, an understanding of existence itself, that human beings are only a small dot in the immense canvas of the cosmos, that the stability we cling to is only a momentary pause, that our knowledge stands forever at the edge of what cannot be predicted. Perhaps the Sumerians never meant to say, the meteor will fall in this exact year. Perhaps they meant something else entirely. What has happened before can happen again, and what you cannot see may already be on its way. It is the humility of a civilization that lived close to the soil, close to the sky, and far too familiar with nature's sudden shifts. A lesson not meant for kings alone, but for anyone who has ever looked up at the night sky and felt how small they truly are. And when we read their warnings today, the 4,000-year distance does not make them strange. If anything, they echo louder, like a quiet message passed from those who came before to those who have not yet been born. And in that dim space, where ancient memory touches the fragility of the modern world, the final door opens softly. As we close this journey and look back toward the Sumerians, those who once stood on temple roofs beneath a night as dense as water, carving into clay every tiny change they saw in the sky with hands that trembled yet never wavered, we begin to understand that the most important question was never whether they were right or wrong. That question has always been far too small compared to what they were truly doing. What we should be asking is this: what compelled such a young civilization to lift its eyes beyond the ground, toward movements in the heavens that were thousands of times larger than their own existence. No one knows whether the object they tracked still exists today, whether the cycle they calculated ever truly threatened the Earth, or whether their warning was the mark of a mind ahead of its age, or simply the fossilized shape of an ancient fear. But one thing is certain. They left humanity a legacy no other civilization could replace, the legacy of not looking away from the sky. A legacy born from the belief that understanding is the only way to stand firm before the unknown. A legacy in which anxiety was transformed into a kind of proto-science, the early foundation of astronomy, of star calendars, of cycles and orbits, of the idea that the universe could be read, measured, and understood. From their small clay tablets, humans learned to record the rhythm of the heavens. From their fears, humans learned to ask questions. From their simple calculations, we eventually reached orbital simulations, impact maps, and knowledge of the dangers drifting in the deep dark of space. Perhaps that is the true light the Sumerians left for the generations after them, not the light of the blazing star they once saw, but the light of a will that refused to shrink before the vastness of the cosmos. They did not let fear become silence. They turned it into data. They turned a fleeting flash into a message for people who would not be born for thousands of years. We may never know exactly what they saw that night, what they calculated in those slanted symbols, or what they feared as they pressed that fateful number into wet clay. But in every surviving tablet there is a faint echo. An echo 4,000 years cannot erase. Are we seeing something coming toward us, the way they once believed they did? The night of ancient Mesopotamia has long since passed, but their question still lingers, suspended somewhere in the darkness above us, where humans remain small and fragile against the motion of forces far beyond our understanding. And as we leave this journey behind, their question remains, quiet as the Mesopotamian night.